Ooh. So I'm glad Comrade Noah's in here so he can correct me if I say anything that happens to be wrong. But today I wanted to talk about the differences between Capital Volumes 1 and 2 because, reading the Capital books is fairly time consuming and energy intensive because not only are they big, but they're fairly dense. So you have to take your time with them if you want to understand everything. So I've been working my way through volume 2, and there are a lot of like video ideas in this book, right? A lot of times I'll be reading this book and I'll think of something will hit me like, oh, I gotta share that on TikTok, or I gotta put that down to talk about it on the stream later. So that does happen, and this book does illuminate and explain a lot about modern capitalism as well as capitalism during Marx's day. But it's a little slow going. Like there's a lot of scientific data based analysis in this book that you have to read through and consume in order to understand Marx's arguments. So, I wanted to start doing some of these like broader, more macro level videos talking about Capital Volume 1 and 2. And what I mean by that is not talking about, something specific within the book, a specific concept, like here's how wages interact with profit, or, here's how the sphere of circulation creates this superstructure of bourgeois economics, or whatever hyper specific things I could talk about. But I also just want to talk about what Volume 2 is. Why was it written? What is its connection to Volume 1? Why are there two different volumes? Couldn't Marx get all of his arguments into one book? Look how big these books are. And it can be kind of intimidating, too, if you haven't started reading Capital. Like, shoot, I got to get through volumes. I can barely get through Volume 1, and now I'm expected to get through Volumes 2 and 3. Like, how am I supposed to do this? So hopefully here in laying out a bit of a framework and laying out some basic things about Capital, I'll be able to help people with that, make people's reading easier and more comprehensible. So yeah, I've read Capital Volume 1 two separate times. It was the first Marxist text, the first book of theory that I ever read. I didn't really understand it other than some, very basic things. And then I took the time to read a whole bunch of little books, like a ton of Lenin, ton of Stalin, ton of Mao, all the basic books that people tell you to start with: Wage, Labor, and Capital, Value, Price, and Profit, Marx's little pamphlet, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Engels, Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State by Engels. So after reading all that, I dove back into Capital for a second time. Capital Volume 1. And the second time, it was the most illuminating book I've ever read in my life. Nothing made the world around me come to life and make sense more than this book once I had a basic grasp on what Marx was saying. But, I had also studied economics at college, so bourgeois economics, the economics that you're taught in the capitalist American Academy. And Volume 1, if I'm being honest, didn't answer a lot of the questions that I had about economics. A lot of the arguments that capitalist bourgeois economists made about capitalism and even about socialism weren't covered in this book. The book was super illuminating, but I didn't find until I opened Capital Volume 2 that Marx starts destroying bourgeois economics thoroughly and absolutely. There are definitely bourgeois economists who he refutes in Volume 1, but once you see Volume 2 and read Volume 2, it's when it really starts to come together. The whole argument starts to come together, and you see the sham, or you see bourgeois economics for the sham that it is. So that's a little bit of an introduction. I was a little bit vague there, but we'll start getting into some more specifics. Volume 1 focuses on the sphere of production, the production process, also known as the labor process, which is humans interacting with nature, using our labor, our human activity, to interact with nature and produce the means of subsistence, the things we need to survive. So for Marx, a productive act, an act of production, could be taking an apple off a tree and eating it, right? That was like the earliest form of production, was just gathering. And then hunting would also be considered production because it's anything, it's the human interacting with nature using our human activity, our labor, to produce the things we need to survive, an apple or whatever else. Now, as humans begin to cooperate and develop tools, their ability to produce increases and increases and increases, and it develops with time. And the way that societies organize the production of the goods that they need to survive changes with time. And this is what Marx is going to be looking at in volume 1, the development of production over time. But more importantly, and more specifically, how production is carried out in a capitalist system, in a capitalist society, a capitalist mode of production, and how capitalism necessitates exploitation, right? It necessitates paying a worker a certain amount for him to work a certain amount of time, and then taking from that worker, the product of his labor, more value than what you pay to the worker. So the worker creates value for capital, which capital then appropriates. That is what Marx is proving in this book, against a lot of the classical economists of his day, who denied that exploitation was a thing. Now, excuse me, in this book, because Marx contains himself to the production process, there are a lot of questions unanswered about circulation. Where does this capital, where do the commodities go after they're produced? Now, Marx is saving all that information because it's going to be in volume 2. Volume 2 focuses explicitly on circulation. So volume 1 is production, the production of commodities by laborers. Volume 2 is circulation. What happens with those commodities, once they're sold and transformed into money, what do the capitalists do with that money? And how does this affect the workers? How does this affect the broader economy? Blah, blah, blah. But volume 1 confines itself to production on purpose, so that it can fully expand this argument, and then detail circulation later on. So that's why it doesn't answer all of the questions that you might have if you've studied economics in the Western capitalist world, because Marx needs to go into his arguments about circulation in order to do that. But this book is so valuable. It is so valuable in understanding that surplus value, profit, the money that capitalists use to accumulate, the money that they exploit from the worker that they don't pay to him in wages, that is all created in production, right? There is a capitalist myth, a bourgeois economic myth, that value is created in circulation, that by moving different kinds of value around and exchanging one kind of value for another kind of value, it's the capitalists who create profit. It's the capitalists who create value. Marx shows, by using the labor theory of value and sticking to a rigorous scientific analysis of capitalist production, that all surplus value is created in production. So the capitalist pays the worker his wages, and then he buys the tools that the worker needs to create this product. Those tools are the product of past workers' labor. They're objectified labor. They were created by other workers, and before they were bought by the capitalist and put into action in the labor process. And only when combining that past labor with new labor can the capitalist make a surplus, right? Either that, or he just has to jack up the price over the actual value of the product, which is something that happens. But the vast majority of capitalist production, and the vast majority of capitalist surplus, comes directly from the production process. And the vast majority of capitalist production is what produces the surplus that capitalists accumulate or that they take as profit. So by hyper-focusing on the production process, Marx is able to prove this and show in no uncertain terms that there's no way to create value without labor. I mean, even just think about it. How are you supposed to create something without interacting with it, with your body as a human? There's no creating anything. There's no creating the commodities that we have around us, the means of subsistence, food, shelter, all the things we need to survive, healthcare, without labor. It all comes from labor. But the people appropriating the surplus, the people accumulating capital and rising to the top of capitalist society and controlling the government in capitalist society, are not those who actually labor. They're not the ones who use their human activity to transform goods into to create more value, and transform materials into goods that can be bought and sold. That is the workers, right? The people who are accumulating the surplus are the capitalists who don't even work at all. So when you just, ignore circulation, ignore what's in volume 2, and you focus on production itself, you isolate the production process, you see that there are people who work and produce value, and there are people who own and don't produce value but move value around in order to maximize their own surplus and compete with other owners in the market. Right? So this is how capitalism works at its core. If you isolate, and stop looking at the way commodities circulate and how the markets work, and I mean, there's some discussion of markets in this for sure, but if you just don't look at the sphere of circulation, the circulation and purchase and sale of commodities, and just isolate the place where commodities are produced, it's obvious that this is exploitation, because nothing except labor can create value, and the capitalists are taking home giant sums of value, well far over what they advance, what they pay to the worker in wages, and what they use to buy their tools. They're getting a huge net surplus. And this is what Marx calls surplus value. And the whole point of this book is to prove that surplus value exists, and surplus value is created in production. It is all created in production. Surplus value cannot be created in circulation. You can only sell something for a price that's higher than its actual value in order to rip someone off. But that value was still created by labor, still created in the production process, right? So if you look at capitalist production in isolation, it's not that much different from feudalism, right? Or even the slavery mode of production, because you have those who own, either the feudal landlords or the slave owners, and then you have those who work. And those who own take everything, take the surplus from those who work, and then just pay them a fraction of what they produce in wages. So if you isolate the production process itself, there are differences between every mode of production, but you see that capitalism is just yet another mode of production where a small group of owners dominate the toiling masses. Now, Volume 2 focuses on circulation. And for those who don't know, Volume 1 is bigger than Volume 2 because this was actually written by Marx, published by Marx, edited by Marx. Marx did the first, second, and third drafts. He thought a lot. And you'll learn this if you read the Grundrisse, which is made up of a lot of Marx's notes. He spent tons of time thinking about how to present this argument. He knew what he wanted to argue at a point. He knew what he needed and wanted to say, but he was constantly debating with himself, how do I say it? What is the best form of presentation? How do I present this information in a way that's readable and understandable? And Volume 1 is still complex. It's still confusing if you're a first-time reader until you get the hang of it. But it's much easier to read, and it's much more fun and entertaining to read than Volumes 2 and 3, because Volumes 2 and 3 were created from Marx's notes. So Marx never got to think about the form of presentation and do a second, third, fourth, fifth draft, thinking about how he's going to present this argument. Engels just took Marx's notes after he died, because he had basically everything that was going to be in Volumes 2 and 3 laid out. And then Engels created the form of presentation. Engels is the one who put it into a book and then published it. So it's not directly from Marx. But after learning about production, it's so much more rewarding to learn about circulation. Like once you read and grasp Volume 1 and then you dig into Volume 2, you'll understand why Marx started with production and isolated production, even though you might not understand it while reading Volume 1. Because you realize that circulation, what circulation is, what market activity is, what the capitalist selling his product is not creating value. It's not creating profit. It's not creating surplus like they tell us it does. It is realizing the value that was created in production already. So the production process happens. The capitalist advances his capital as wages and tools. The workers' labor paid for with wages is combined with the tools, which was created by past workers' labor, in the production process, and commodities are ejected from the production process. A mass of commodities comes out of the production process worth more value than what it took to start the production process, than what it took to pay for the tools and the wages that created these commodities. So those commodities, when they come out of production, have already created for the capitalist more value than what he started with, right? The surplus value exploited from the surplus labor of the workers is already there, right? The capitalist pays the worker for part of his day in wages, and then the worker works the rest of his day for free. And the capitalist steals that value from him that he creates in the surplus part of the working day, which is all contained in volume 1. So all that the capitalist has to do then is sell those commodities that are already imbued with more value than what the capitalist started with, right? All he has to do is find somebody to sell them to, and then that value that's been created is realized, meaning it comes back to the capitalist. Sorry, I punched my mic. It comes back to the capitalist in the form of money, right? He started the circuit with money. He paid money for wages. He paid money for tools. They went into the production process, volume 1. Commodities were ejected with more value than he originally advanced, but they're stuck in the form of a commodity. They're not money yet. So the capitalist has all these commodities, but he can't use that to expand production. He can't take those commodities as profit. He can't exchange those commodities for other commodities, not until they become money, not until he sells them in a market. And then the commodities that already have more value than what he started with are transformed once again into money, more money than what the capitalist started with. And he can restart the production process, buy more wages and more tools, or he can even expand the production process. He can make it larger and try and control more markets because there was more value created than what he started with. So the capitalist now has a surplus, right? So in the circulation process, the value created in production is realized, meaning it's transformed from commodities into money, so that the capitalist can take it and hoard it in his bank account or expand production, restart production, all of these different things. But there's this bourgeois economic myth that the capitalists are the ones creating value. That value is created in the sphere of circulation. That value is created by selling things on the market. No, buying and selling things on the market only realizes value that was created in production. So the value created in volume 1 is realized and circulated and reinvested in volume 2. So it works really well together as a pair or as a sequel, because you see, in no uncertain terms, how value is created by labor, and how the capitalist appropriates the surplus value of the worker, and how, the capitalist, unless he works himself, cannot create any value. And then in volume 2, you get into the discussion of how that value circulates, how it works on the market, which, engages a lot more with the bourgeois economics, the mainstream, economics arguments that you hear in capitalist countries in the West. But Marx couldn't have started with that, right? He couldn't have started with that because he needs to answer this question first of where does value come from? Because the capitalists are just saying, value comes from us selling stuff on the market. So before he gets into, analyzing the markets and analyzing how capitalists accumulate and how they, sell their commodities and exchange their commodities and how they do all this stuff on the market in what we call the sphere of circulation, he has to first show how value is created so he can prove that value is not created through market transactions, through market exchanges. So he proves that first in volume 1. Then he moves on to analyzing the market exchanges. Then he moves on to analyzing the sphere of circulation. And one of the things that I thought when reading volume 1, I was like, when I read this, I'll be able to understand how capitalist crises work, right? I'll be able to understand why the system periodically goes into recession before, sort of recovering like that. And these cyclical cycles that it's called the business cycle in modern bourgeois neoclassical economics that you would learn at college. And there are, you do learn things about crisis in this book. It is there, it's present, and the seeds of crisis are being laid in production sometimes. But not until volume 2 do you really, really, really start to get a grasp on crises and how crises can happen, right? Like Marx wanted to do a separate volume of Capital that he never got around to before he died, just analyzing crises and how they can occur. And we've talked to Radhika Desai, a great Marxist academic in Canada today, about the different kinds of crises. And that's what she's done a lot of her work on, a lot of her writing on, has been on all the different kinds of capitalist crises, how they happen and how they differ from each other. So this isn't a comprehensive analysis of crises, but he really gets into talking about crisis, why it happens, and it becomes very obvious why it happens, right? Because you have this value that's created in the production process that comes out in the form of commodities, right? It's some product that was produced by the labor of those workers. But the capitalist can't use those, right? The capitalist can't use that to buy more factories, to buy more tools, to pay his workers wages. He needs to transform those commodities into money. And he does this by selling them on the market. So if a bunch of capitalists aren't able to continually sell their commodities on the market, those commodities will just sit as a hoard, right? The capitalists will just hang on to them, or they'll sit in the store, but they'll never be sold and transformed into money, which means the production process is going to suffer because the capitalist isn't going to have money to pay for his tools. He's not going to have money to pay for his wages, and the production process is going to come to a halt, which means the production of value will come to a halt. The production of surplus will come to a halt. The production of the means of subsistence will come to a halt, or at least will greatly slow. And people will get laid off of their work, laid off from their jobs. I don't know what I was trying to say there. Production processes will be shut down. Much less commodities will be produced. The commodities that are on the market, capitalists will jack up the prices because they're not selling as many and they're not making as much money. So they're threatened to go out of business due to market competition. So you see that there's the value. I mean, while volume 1 isolates production and volume 2 isolates circulation, you can't understand capitalism unless you see the connection between the two. Because surplus value is created in production, and yes, that's exploitation, right? But the exploitation doesn't do the capitalist any good until he sells what's produced on the market, until it circulates, until that value is realized, right? And in this whole complex process, if that value doesn't become realized, there's going to be a crisis that affects the entire society and throws the entire society into a state of economic destitution. So yeah, volumes 1 and 2, why it's important to understand the production of surplus value and how that surplus value is realized through circulation. Sphere of production, volume 1, is where value is produced, surplus value and just reproduction value. The sphere of circulation, capital volume 2, is where that surplus value is realized and then reinvested in production again. I mean, volume 1 talks about the reinvestment in production because there's tons on accumulation. But accumulation will make even more sense once you read volume 2. And then for those curious, I haven't read volume 3, but volume 3 is about the connection of circulation and production. How do they connect? How does circulation affect production? How does circulation being interrupted affect production in a time of crisis? So ultimately, I know it's intimidating to hear, yeah, you got to read Marx's Capital, and you also have to read it multiple times. And then after you read it multiple times, you got to move on to, volumes 2 and 3. And those are also like 1,000 pages. I don't know what volume 1's like over 900 and volume 2 is like over 500. Volume 3 is like 900. That can be intimidating. That's a lot of pages to read. But it's also illuminating, right? Like keep in mind that if you make it through all 3 of these volumes and be patient with it, you don't have to rush through them. You're going to understand the whole capitalist system pretty much. You're going to understand all of the mechanisms that make things move, which is why it requires, so many volumes and why Marx had plans to write like 8 volumes, because capitalism is a very complex system. So it requires a very complex abstraction. It requires a very complex academic theoretical analysis. Theoretical analysis is the better word there. So it needs to be complex, right? So don't rush through it. Don't get discouraged. You're going to learn a lot if you just read volume one, or if you just, puttered your way through it. But by the time you get through volumes, 2 and 3, you're going to be like, I know everything about the system. These bourgeoisie cannot lie to me any longer. So hopefully that gives some people the motivation to truck through volumes 2 and 3 after you finish volume one. It's so fun to read volumes 2 and 3 after you've read volume one, right? Especially if you're like me and you've studied bourgeois capitalist economics and you're waiting for Marx to talk about supply and demand and market exchange and market transactions and how they affect this and that. And how that, what the pro-capitalist bourgeois economists said about it compared to what the truth is. After reading volume one, you dig into volume two and you get all of that. All of those questions are answered. But because you have the background knowledge of volume one, they're answered in a way that makes perfect sense. So hopefully that makes sense. I know I've kind of rambled and gone into the weeds here, but that was sort of the purpose of this segment, to go into the weeds with theory, which I want to start doing more and more in these streams. Not just the ones where I'm with Carlos, but even the ones where I'm just on my own. Because one of my favorite parts about the streams is the direct interaction with the audience. And it bugs me. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I don't want to be like a streamer, right? Like, the purpose of these streams is entertainment. I want to entertain you guys and make it fun to watch, but the main purpose is education, right? The main purpose is, here's how we understand theory in the world around us. Here's how we organize to make the world around us and society better, right? Sort of like we're all training right now. We all know that we're comrades, or most of us are comrades, but now we're sharpening our swords. We're sharpening our theoretical weapons to take into battle against the bourgeoisie. That's kind of how I look at a lot of these streams. So before I answer this super chat, let me just make sure that I touched on everything in my notes. Plus value and accumulation is, I should say too, and volume one touches on this, but it's like the last part of volume one in the transition to volume two. Accumulation is necessitated by the production of surplus value. So if the capitalist is creating more value and getting more money back than what he originally advanced, what he originally started with, if he's getting a surplus, part of that surplus is going to have to be reinvested in expanding production, producing more than what he was before. Otherwise, he's going to be outcompeted by other capitalists on the market. So if I continually just take all of my surplus home as profit and hoard it in my bank account, while the local competitor in town is taking his surplus and investing it in better tools, and more tools, and more marketing or whatever else, marketing assists with circulation and the realization of value. But either way, I'm going to eventually be outcompeted and I'm going to go out of business. So this is what we call accumulation, which isn't just the accumulation of hordes of money, right? That's what we call hoarding, but it's the reinvestment of surplus in more tools, in expanded production, which will lead to more value for the capitalists, which then needs to be realized. So yeah, accumulation follows as a result of the production of surplus value and the realization of that value. Volume two also talks about volume one talks about accumulation, and volume two talks specifically about after the capitalist sells his commodities on the market, after that value is transformed into money, he has to reinvest a certain amount in production in order to maintain his current operation. So this is what Marx calls reproduction, right? If he spends $5 on wages paying his workers and $5 on tools and raw materials for the worker to work on, for a total of 10, he then needs to take $10 out of the surplus value of the commodities that are produced and that he sells on the market. At least $10 need to be reinvested in those tools and reinvested in that labor. Otherwise, the production process will cease to exist, right? But then the money over $10, that is his surplus. So everything over $10 is his surplus, and he can take some home as profit and invest some in accumulating or expanded production. But 10 have to be invested in reproduction, right? Then you have expanded production or accumulation, which is where the capitalist pays the $10 to restart production and puts another $5 into more wages and more tools. That's expanded production, taking the scale of production and using the surplus to increase it so more value can be created. Or they can take it, and hoard it in a bank account, which is hoarding. And a lot of times there's like a reserve fund. Capitalists will keep an emergency fund if there's a crisis and they don't have enough capital, enough money to restart the circuit and maintain production. They'll have an emergency fund that they can take and use on that. So not only does volume 2 focus on how value is realized, but then also how the capitalists utilize that realized value and reinvest it in production. And I'm sure volume 3 will focus on that more specifically if I had to guess. Yes. All right. I finished everything in my notes. So that's volumes 1, 2, and kind of volume 3 that I haven't read. So hopefully that was helpful to some people. Wow. Molly McGuire, single working mom with a little extra time. Thank you for your labor. Here's something to put into circulation. Yes. Thank you, Molly. Thank you for also leaving a comment that shows me you understood what I was talking about. Yes. So when we as consumers buy something on the market, we're just using a piece of our wages to buy a piece of the means of subsistence, what we need to survive, and what for the capitalist reproduces our labor. The means of subsistence, the food, shelter, water, and stuff that we need to survive is reproducing our labor value for the capitalist by keeping us alive. But either way, yes, that is circulation. That is the capitalist realizing their value when you buy it. And every commodity you buy has the value of the wages that it took, or the labor and wages that it took to make it, the value of the tools that it took to make it, which the capitalist will reinvest in reproduction, and it has a surplus. And you're buying it for its actual value, whereas the worker is being paid a fraction of the value that he creates through wages. So yeah, I mean, this, like volumes 1 and 2, once you understand them, this is what I mean by you can understand like the world around you. You get, you think about every purchase differently. I go buy a Snickers bar from the gas station. I'm thinking about who made it, what tools and raw materials were created to make it. What did it take to circulate that Snickers? What did it take to bring it to the store, so that I could purchase it? Changes the way that you see the whole world and things that you had never thought about before. But sorry, that was a tangent. Thank you so much, Molly.